joined today by Tom Dennis from Tarndwarncoort Station. Good to see you, my friend. It's been I was end of November I was over there visiting.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Well, in all those days ago, it feels so long ago, doesn't it? Hey?
I know, and who would have thought when we were all there that we would be in this situation that we are today?
I'm glad you did, Marie, because you'd be able to see what we're talking about here now, and it sort of makes sense when you've actually been to the place. So I'm super glad that you got in when you did, and
definitely. Yeah, exactly. So Thomas, where he's sitting is you're actually sort of sitting off to the side, like on the front patio, just off to the right-hand side of the shop, aren't you? Looking back down towards the homestead behind you. So you've got a really lovely spot there, complete with Australian wildlife chirping in the background. So it's all very authentic.
And there might be a cameo role by my dog at some point as well.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that's a fixture of the Quarantine Diaries. I've already got one of mine in the she shed with me, and the other one is sitting outside the door, and he may start crying, but the one that's outside the door is 116 kilos, and he doesn't fit in my little she shed very well. So I don't let him in. Yeah, and he gets very, very upset. So there you go. So look, let's start off. You, as I mentioned, you're from Tarndwarncoort, but where exactly are you? So I know where you are because I've been there, but let's put it into context for everybody else.
Yeah, great, and thanks everyone for tuning in. And to Marie, thanks for giving us this opportunity. It's pretty quiet out here, so it's nice to talk to people, even if it is by this strange kind of means today. We're very much about connecting to people and having them visit the farm. So the farm itself is in Victoria, so southeast Victoria, Australia. So Melbourne, travel west past Geelong towards the Great Ocean Road, and then about half an hour inland from the Great Ocean Road is where we are. So it's called the Otways as the region, and we're at the very northern fringes of it, where the Otway Ranges, which is a sort of a heavy rainfall rainforest sort of situation, where it starts to meet the Victorian volcanic plain, which is a big flat area with the occasional extinct volcano popping out, and the soil is really good for that reason. So we're not far from Melbourne.
Yes. Now, you, as a family, you have been there for a really long time. So talk a little bit more about the history of how the farming there originated, because I mean, you guys are pretty much an origin location, origin farmers there, and then we'll move through about the entire Polwarth story.
Yeah, look, history can be a bit of a dull thing, but sometimes it's nice to dwell on it, and because you start to learn a little bit about decisions that people made and the landscape around you when you think about how that history played out. So, as I mentioned before, we're here in an area where there's volcanic soil to one side and then high rainfall to the other, and that tells you that it was a really good place and fertile place to go farming. And that's kind of the key to why we're here, is because back in 1830s Cornwall in southeast England, there was limited opportunity for a family that had been farming there for about 200 years in all sorts of livestock and horticulture and grain growing and milling. So they were looking around for opportunities. And so at that point, Port Phillip District, or Australia Felix as it was also known, this sort of corner of New South Wales was being explored and discovered, as it were, by the Europeans. And that then sort of created a reason to come out this way and start farming. So they wanted to do farming, and they knew that wool was a market that they could readily enter because the Industrial Revolution in the UK had got to a point where there was a demand for raw material. So it kind of made sense to go sheep farming. It was something they knew about, and so these new lands being opened up kind of was a logical choice for them. So we're in the same spot as we are in 1840. And so in the European context, and I really want to make it clear that this is a European story, and there's a fantastic Aboriginal story that we could talk about, but it's not necessarily my place. But I wanted to definitely acknowledge the fact that we're not the traditional owners of this area, and the Gulidjan people have got an amazing story to tell that one day hopefully we can share with people. But this is very much a European story, so that's kind of my story to tell. And so what the Europeans had done is come across from Tasmania looking for land to run sheep in about 1835. So this is being 5 years after that, sort of places it quite early in the European story of this part of the world.
Yeah, and I mean, comparatively to New Zealand even earlier, I mean, the Treaty of Waitangi, I think, was still, hadn't been signed by that stage. So it's, it's very, very early on in the piece. And certainly too coming from Cornwall as well, because I know during that time in Cornish history, I mean, the farming was difficult, and I think mining was I think tin mining from memory was very much the
most of the people that emigrated from Cornwall went to work in mines around the world, really, and certainly in Australia that was the thing. So having that pastoral and small scale farming expertise was a really good benefit to early European Australia.
And you can certainly see the Cornish influence just in the homestead behind you.
Exactly. I was lucky enough to go to the house that they lived in before emigrating out to Australia, and it's a replica of this one here. So it's they certainly drew depended on those Cornish sort of design techniques as well.
So they arrive in what was actually New South Wales still then, wasn't it? In Australia, in Australia, and they get themselves established with farming. So how did they go to generate the flock? Because I mean, obviously sheep aren't indigenous to Australia, so these needed to be brought out. So how did they go about that? Did they start bringing livestock out from their home flocks back in Cornwall, or were they bringing them from all round? How did that work?
Yeah, so there'd been some pretty early work done in that. In New South Wales around Sydney, where when you look at the early colonial history of Australia, it was a as everyone knows, it was a convict settlement program. So it wasn't necessarily a opportunistic. What do you call it? It was there needed to be an industry from the outset. There was just these guys being dumped there, and they needed to be bringing in some money, and they needed to be doing some work. So sheep from the very, very outset were recognised as something that would suit. So they were brought across mainly from, I believe, from sort of Germany and South Africa and Spain, those sort of merino flocks. And then also, and that was around Sydney. And then there was also some good work done in Tasmania with bringing out, again, Saxon merinos, as well as other types of merino and some meat sheep. But when it came to setting up the Tarndwarncoort flock, then it was drawing from the Tasmanian merino flocks. So that's where a mission was sent down to collect all the supplies you should need for life in the bush. Which I think would be quite an interesting exercise, really, wouldn't it? Imagine if you were just kind of heading off into the largely unknown with all of those support bases sort of left behind. Like, right, what do I need for the next 180 years?
Well, exactly. And I mean, see, where you are now, it doesn't seem quite so isolated, because when you drive there, you've got, one of the main motorways in Victoria pretty much running almost, just down, like very close to where you are.
Thank great-grandfather for that. Actually, that's some good
work. Good on your pops. And so, getting there now in the modern world is fantastic. But, I mean, I don't know how new the settlement of Geelong was, but I mean, in those days, Geelong would have been a good day's ride away, I would have thought, whereas now it's like 10, 15 minutes by car. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of brings into focus what this was about. And it was a homestead that was supported by a lot of people, because they were mutually dependent on each other. They really relied on their network around them locally. So there was a Wesleyan church mission station just nearby, about 10 kilometres away, also run by some young Cornish people. And so their network was very dependent on those around them. And you start to see this sort of model of self-sufficiency evolve around the home. You know what, we need milk. We can't get that today because Geelong's a long way away. So we need a cow. We need somebody to look after the cow. We need somebody to cook the food for the person looking after the cow, and they need to be educated and sent to church. So all of a sudden, this sort of village grows, and it's all about growing wool. But the upshot of it is that there's this settlement and community of people.
Yeah, and it would have grown, and you can see that it's because it's Tarndwarncoort is the small little village you drive through before you get to you, isn't it? Is that the name of it? Yeah. And so when you drive through that little village, guys, it is small. It is honestly a handful of shops and some really lovely houses. But the thing that you noticed about that is actually the age of a lot of the properties still there. There is still a lot of original architecture there, and they are all dated sort of that late 1800s, 1860s, 1870s, around there by the look of them, which then shows that that village has started to be populated, like the seed has been that farm, and everything else that is required to actually grow that has come from that one location. So I guess for you, I mean, what generation are you now? Fifth generation? Sixth?
Number 6, and then 6.
Yeah.
6, right? 6 plus 6, mate.
Yeah.
And so then brother Al, who runs the sheep here on the farm, his little girl is generation 7.
Yeah, so it must be, I mean, for her to be able to pass that history down all the way through is really quite an amazing thing. And as you said, sometimes history can be a bit dry, but one of the things we've talked about on the diaries is the reflective, it's time like this that you actually can reflect on that history, because one of the things that I've said to my 2 boys, who one of them has had a birthday during this time, is that they will never forget this period of time. When they are our age, they will be saying to their children or families or friends, oh gosh, do you remember when we were in, the virus lockdown, or whatever they choose to call it? It will become that sort of watershed moment in their life. Yeah. And I mean, I think for your family, when they created that, there were a whole variety of those probably all the way through that luckily so much of it has been, in your case, documented, because, without those, I mean, we've all got the internet now. I mean, it's around forever, isn't it, in the digital?
That's right. Yeah. It is very, and you know what, I take a great amount of solace in that at this moment when I think, okay, let's have a look at Generation 3. He had a period where and this is quite typical of a family business, where a family business, farming, shoe shops, whatever it is, generally has this 3-generation bell curve where Generation 1 will set out with a great idea and passion and get this thing really booming, whatever it is, whatever that industry is. Generation 2 kind of rolls with it during the good times, and perhaps kind of overindulges or doesn't have the same drive or passion. But continues on anyway because it's quite a comfortable kind of situation. Generation 3 is often left with the fallout of those decisions made in Generation 2, or just simply doesn't have an interest in it.
And in our family, because I'm from good Irish stock, and the thing in our family is Generation 1 sows it, Generation 2 grows it, and Generation 3 blows it. So
yeah, absolutely. That's great. And so when I look at Generation 3 in this instance, when that this sort of natural phenomena would be to pack up and give it a go. He was on the back of that. He was faced with sort of all of these forces outside of his own control. So there was a drought in 1890 that lingered for a long time after a period of land speculation that went bust. There was sort of money tied up in all sorts of things. Flowed into World War I, where all of his brothers were sent off to war, so he had to look after not only his own farm here, but also in the other parts of the Dennis sort of farming enterprise around Victoria. That sort of flowed into the Great Depression, which I don't think affected this part of the world too much, but certainly there was a lot of pressure on society.
Huge.
That into World War II, when all his sons were sent off to war, and again he had to look after all of these farms by himself. And then at the very end of World War II, the entire farm burnt. So he had a really rough trot. He got through it, and by all accounts, he was a guy that had a lot of vision and integrity and all these sorts of things, which I can only assume is sort of a characteristic that's come about because he's been shaped by these events. So I think perhaps it's okay for me today. I know there's a lot of people in a lot of trouble, but we're doing okay, and the people before us have certainly had a rough trot as well. So let's take a bit of courage from them.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the things that with this time is that there is, I mean, it is a time of great change, but I think, as you've just pointed out, if you're able to actually persevere through it and keep working through it, you ultimately are going to come out the other side richer, and that riches may not necessarily be from a monetary standpoint, but they certainly may be from a standpoint of character or community. We're certainly seeing that in New Zealand, and I'm sure that you're seeing that in Australia as well. So it's a really, really interesting time. So so they're on the farm now. You've got the first couple of generations, they're nice and established. They've got this wonderful community they're starting to bring around them. They've drawn these flocks in from Tasmania and other places. How then do they go to creating that Polwarth that is something that is so uniquely yours?
Yeah, that's a great point, isn't it? And largely it's shaped by environment and climate. So talking about the fact that we have a high rainfall, sort of, let's call it a mountain range, but when I'm talking to you Kiwis, it's certainly not. It's just
it's a very lovely set of rolling hills in the background, but mountains, potato, yeah.
Yeah. Our methods, and so that obviously impacts the soil, and like we're starting to realise, soil is kind of everything about our existence. We've got good soil, it's going to produce good things. So it's a wet environment, and the Saxon Merinos that we had been running with from 1840 were faring well enough, but in the wetter conditions, it was found that their feet were
they're not fond of wet feet of a merino. Right.
Yeah, and their feet, their fleece was starting to collect water and rot, and so that then affects the health of the sheep, not only the quality of the wool and the value of it, but the health of the sheep. And so so there was sort of a bit of work in the 1880s, not a bit of work, a lot of work was done in the 1880s by let me get a prop, by Richard Dennis. Let me introduce Richard, because he's actually half sheep. When you look at that beard, I don't know.
Well, I was just going to say he would be very relevant today, wouldn't he? I mean, he was the hipster of his day, Tom.
Suit, beard there, and slick.
Yeah, he was the hipster of his day.
Sadly for Richard, though, he had an accident with the wool press very early in life at age 13. And I don't know if you can imagine one of these wool presses back in the day. It had a big crank like this with a spring on it, and somehow that big crank shaft released, and then as he was walking past, smacked him in the hip, and severely impaired him for life. So he couldn't really get around so well. He did a lot of his farm work off the back of a horse, but he certainly wasn't as agile out in the paddock as he could have been. So what that meant is he had a lot of downtime to be able to kind of study things properly and put a keen eye through all of this nature around us, and certainly taxidermy and these sorts of things were really popular in the late 19th century, and so he had a real fascination in nature. And he worked out, okay, these Saxon Merinos are not performing as well as they could be. What can we do to resolve that? And so also in Australia, in Victoria at that time, were Lincoln sheep. So these are from Lincolnshire in England, a high rainfall area. This is a really sturdy sheep.
And they've got quite a long, I see you're being dog bombed there. And I can see they had quite a long, there you go. They've got a really long staple to them as well. Yeah.
Right, yeah. And really,
so the rain sort of washes off in a way.
Exactly, yeah. So, and the feet are sturdy as anything. And so they were around for a meaty kind of purpose in this part of the world. And so Richard was doing some work to cross over the Saxon Merino with the Lincoln, and the progeny of that essentially went through a line breeding program, but also, the progeny that went back to the Merino, and then the progeny that went through a line breeding program. So that was happening here at Tarndwarncoort in 1870s, 1880s.
Wow.
Because by this stage there was quite a lot of Dennises on farms around, that same the same sort of breeding profile was replicated on two other farms within the sort of 2 to 3 hours away, and so they became these sort of three foundation flocks that bred to the same sort of specifications. They were looking for a sheep that was dual purpose, essentially, that could have good wool that the spinning mills were comfortable with, and also a meaty sheep that they could sell for domestic market as well. The business model for all farmers, regardless of what they tell you, is that they're going to maximise revenue per acre. So it's how to
Yeah.
to do that. So in this case, it was about having a dual purpose sheet.
Yeah.
Down the track, we've worked out that there's some really great benefits of the fibre, but certainly that was what they were looking to in the first place.
I know I've often talked about in previous podcasts that I've done is about the uni sheep, and and Polwarth, it was probably the original uni sheep because it was the one that was able to cross that boundary between both worlds. Perrindale is another one in this country that sort of crosses that boundary, and it's one of those really difficult things because I think now and I think after this period of time we will start reflecting back to how things were, but when things are really, really good, it's very easy to romanticize things like, the wonderful things at Just Merino and these lovely sort of romantic images of standing on the highlands of Tasmania or up in the Alps or the Mackenzie Basin of New Zealand and have this beautiful romantic notion. But the reality of it is farming is bloody hard work, and it's really, really difficult to actually make sure that, you've got huge fixed costs, massive overheads. It's not just maintaining. You might be land rich, but generally cash flow poor. So, very cash. Farmer's daughter, can't you tell? And it's really intriguing to see that, those sorts of struggles that they're having then, those are still the realities I think our farmers are facing today. And they've, I think in recent times, had a huge amount of pressure placed on them by quite modern romantic notions about farming, when in reality that there are sometimes some of those hard decisions that need to be made. Are we growing flocks for wool? Are we growing flocks for meat? How do we create something that is going to give us greater value on our farm? And again, as you said, in the 1850s, 1860s, not a lot's changed, isn't it? History can teach us a lot.
That's exactly right. That's really well put, Marie. It is Australia's kind of going through this process at the minute where, and I think it's probably overnight sort of resolved itself, but certainly agriculture across the board in Australia is kind of wanting to position itself as something sexy. So how do you get people to A, work in the industry, or B, value the product that comes out of the industry? And so I think, to be honest, a lot of people have gone all of a sudden, I wouldn't mind being on a farm right now growing my own tomatoes. So there is that romantic notion that hopefully kind of comes back, but in a way that helps the viability of farming, because there are really good years when all of a sudden all of these external influences have kind of merged and you get a good price. But there's so many external influences in farming that I don't think a lot of other industries are exposed to. And they can just make it really hard work for people to persevere.
Absolutely. And I mean, I know here in New Zealand, for the last, few years, farming has been, and it doesn't matter what sort of farming it is, whether it's agriculture, horticulture, viticulture, agrarian farming, there has been this almost, farming has copped a bit of a bad rap and has been not considered as clean or trendy or anything that it is now perceived. And all of a sudden, literally in the space of less than 90 days, less than 3 months, the whole world has been tipped on its head. And actually, I think for a lot of people in the city, those farmers, they ain't so bad now. They're the ones that are keeping things on the shelves in the supermarket. And as a growing nation, it's food is not an issue here like it is in some other parts of the world. So it's I think for farming, I actually believe farming is going to see a renaissance through the 2020s. I really, really do. So you touched before on the fibre. So you mentioned before they found this uni sheep. They had this wonderful fibre and they had this meat, but over time, as you said, the fibre, the value of the fibre and the properties of the fibre have actually been slowly embraced over the time. And talk a little bit more about that, because our story, that's where our stories start to intersect. So how did that sort of come about? I mean, is that something that happened early on, or was it through the industrial and particularly the manufacturing, through things like, I know the World Wars played quite a huge part in terms of the wool industry, in terms of textiles and spinning and being able to create and get raw materials for fabrics, for uniforms and the like. How did that work with the Polwarth story?
So let me just tell you a little bit about the fibre in itself, because I'm sure there's some fibre nuts out there that sort of want to know some specifications, like what is this Polwarth thing they might not have come across before. But essentially, the fibre of a Polwarth looks it sort of fits nicely between a medium wool merino and a Corriedale. Essentially, it sort of sits in that gap there. So in terms of micron count, we're looking at about 21 to 24 kind of range. And if you're working in spinning counts, the philosophy of the Breeders Association has always been to sort of be about 58s count. So sort of 58s to 60, and we can go into what that means. But the micron is there. The fibre length is around about 100 mil. I've got some to show you here, but I'm in a bit of a hurry. I grabbed something and it sort of reflects a little bit shorter from this year's shearing. But certainly with other breeders, we're looking at 100, 110 over 12-month growing. And the fleece is known to be quite lofty. It has a demi-luster to it, and that's that Lincoln kind of genetics, and that's a shine to it. It's sort of you've probably seen some of those English breeds that are quite blingy.
Blue face Leicester can be very, very blingy. Yeah,
exactly. Compared to some of the sort of the more softer, finer fibers. So that's the kind of the profile of it, and quite crimpy. So it's when it's spun, it has that loft in it due to that quite defined crimp. And so the very early days, it was about the commercial mills appreciating the fibre. So obviously, if they didn't want to buy it, then that wouldn't have gone any further. But the war was certainly interesting when you think about war. There's I think up until I'm sorry to diverge off into the history.
No, that's all right. I can bring you back to the garden path, darling. You diverge as much as you like.
Sadly, there's this kind of link between war and demand for raw materials, like you say, and in the 1950s, it was before synthetics came on scene. There was this real demand for Australian. I think it was actually tied up to a trade deal that the Australian and US governments did about the Korean War. It's like Australia will send military support for the campaign, so long as the US bought heaps of Australian wool. So there was this price spike that happened because of that war concept. Anyway, so the fibre itself has that commercial sort of appeal, and then it's obviously just worked along the way. So I've actually just on that, I've got a little bit of what a commercially spun Polwarth yarn kind of looks like, because we talk a lot about hand knitting yarns, but in terms of the and that really only represents a very small amount of Polwarth wool that goes out there. But really, what it ends up being is a commercial fabric like this. So, when it's worsted spun, it's a very thin, lovely, soft fibre. But when you compare it to a merino suit, as we're kind of very well accustomed, it's got that little bit more durability about it. So for your suit pants, for example, for guys, obviously you want a little bit more sort of durability. So that's why it's popular with the high end sort of
textiles
in the textile industry, is because it has that slight bit of extra durability owing to the strength of the fibre, the fibre diameter. And so.
And I know from a spinning perspective, the one thing our technical manager, Matthew August at the mill, if you ever want to get that man smiling, you just bring him a 21 micron, a 10 to 11 centimetre staple Polwarth, and that boy is smiling all the way through the mill. It is, if there was an apex fibre, I know for our process, being a worsted spun process, to spin, that is like the ultimate, the one fibre that doesn't give us any grief. It behaves so beautifully. It is the golden child of fibres. It is definitely Polwarth. I mean, we just absolutely adore it, and well, you know that because you have had some spun with us, so we just love it. And it is just, and hand spinners, I mean, I'm a very rudimentary hand spinner, but I do know a number of hand spinners who that is their primary fibre craft, and they just adore it. If you are, I mean, so many hand spinners, if you say to them, what is the number one fibre you love to spin, ultimately most of them will come out, if it's a wool fibre, they'll say Polwarth, every single time.
Yeah, and I guess that owes to its length. where it's a nice fibre to be able to draw out, and versatility. It can go quite fine, but also but yeah, it's a wonderful fibre from that perspective, and the nice thing is that people around the world have got access to it now. So it was a breed that sort of started out here on this farm, but in the about, I think, turn of the century, 1900, a flock went across to South America, and set up there. They're known there as Ideal, as in, but the genetics come from here. And so that's kind of where the bulk of the Polwarth is produced these days, in Uruguay, where they're growing bull sheep in up to 2.5 meters of rainfall each year.
Wow,
is quite phenomenal for when you think about the picture of a merino, what it's sort of eating and living within. It's a very dry, hardy landscape. But comparison to that, this South American scene is quite unbelievable. So
I've actually just been. I was in Uruguay in January, and I was actually, I didn't realize. I mean, I knew they had a wool industry there because obviously there's a number of companies, very high profile companies based out of Uruguay, but I didn't realize how similar both the climate and the landscape were to. I'm from Hawke's Bay, you're from Victoria. From a climate perspective, both those areas, there is a lot of similarities, and Uruguay was the same. I mean, I visited some areas on the outskirts of Montevideo, and I could have been easily in Hawke's Bay or driving through, the Central Valley or anywhere like that. It was quite astounding, actually, the similarities. And you can see that that's why things that work so well for us are obviously working really well over there as well.
Yeah, so the Polwarth is sort of spread all around the world now. So people have got a bit of access to it, and it's kind of humbling because a lot of the time we just operate in a bubble that spans about 5 kilometres, and we think we're the only Polwarth breeders in the world, but actually it's a really strong thing outside of Australia. And still in Australia, there's a good strong breeder base. And it's quite active. We celebrated 100 years of an association just last year, and that drew out a lot of really interesting information. And we're lucky to have a grower from New Zealand come across as the judge, and he talked about his Polwarth operation.
Is he not Mate Kanui by any chance? Is it?
Yes. Once more,
Mate Kanui.
Martin from. It's a tricky name. Mate
Kanui. It'll be Mate Kanui, probably in the central Otago. Yeah, because he's one of the big guys over here, and that's who we buy a lot of our New Zealand source Polwarth is from.
Yeah, great. Okay. Kiwi names. I've only been once.
He's the man from a place called Tarndwarncoort. Just putting it out there, Tom. Let's not play the quirky name game.
Tip of the hat for pronunciation. Actually, you've gone back a generation or so. We've got an old Aunt Jess who used to live next door. She was literally born in the house next door, and she called it that, but nobody else did. So I think you might have channeled the inner Aunt Jess and get
there you go. She sounds like a good Sheila, your Aunt Jess. Like her. Liking her already.
Yeah.
So where to now? So like for us, for Polwarth, we use Polwarth a lot with a number of yarns that we have produced for ourselves and also yarns that we produce for other clients. So Deborah from Outlaw Yarn, who you met when she was part of the group that we were over, and Deb Polwarth is a huge foundation of a number of her yarns. So where to now? I mean, are you because sheep people are sheep people, and anybody who's really passionate about something, and you mentioned about your association. Is the passion there still alive? Where are they hoping to? What's the next steps now? Are they looking?
Yeah, you know what? It's interesting. We're always interested to know about the next thing. And I over the course of this weekend, and with this chat in mind, I decided I was going to read a book that charted the first 100 years of the breed here.
You're welcome, Tom.
My entire life. But I've always sort of flicked on, oh, that's a bit dry. I don't think I'll read that just now. But it was written in 1980 by Uncle Noel, who had the farm just to the north of us. And so often he's referred to this phase as hastened slowly. In the breeding program, those original breeders were hastening slowly, and then in his sort of, it's a bit of a manifesto really about what a Polwarth sheep should be and all this, from the thoughts of somebody who helped develop the flock in the first place. And so his approach was the number one, and this is written in 1981, so maybe the times have changed, but his approach was the number one priority should be to ensure stability. Mm-hmm. And so for him it was about let's just bed down the fact that a Polwarth represents a micron count that looks like this, a body frame that looks like this on the sheep, mm-hmm. And it just cements what it is, rather than trying to chase a finer type of
so it's creating a breed standard essentially.
That's right, and really just sticking to that. So in some ways, while on 180 years ago, whatever it is, we talked about adapting and changing. Now they're sort of saying, look, let's just stick to the knitting. We've got a good product that suits this environment. It's not going to suit everybody else's environment, but it's an option for people to adopt this into their breeding program. So the future of a Polwarth sheep, I'd say, is very strong here. The dual purpose nature is never something that farmers are putting aside and saying, what, we're only going to do we're only going to do meat because of these external things, circumstances that shape farming. So the nature of a dual purpose sheep is still strong. There's a lot of other dual purpose sheep out there, like a South African meat merino, like a Dooney.
Corriedale would be another. Pirindale would be another in this country. Yeah.
So we're all sort of in the same boat in some degree, but I think a lot of people recognise the value in having these elements of diversity. So what the Polwarth might do well in one place being having a clear open face so that there's no wool blindness or anything like that. Maybe that's a particular trait of Polwarth. So let's just keep Polwarth looking like that while the other guys can concentrate on areas. So the breed is strong here. There's some really great wool coming off, particularly our neighbours at Fairview, just about 10 k's away. Beautiful long wool around about that 22 micron, and bright. They do a really good amount of work with their breeding program in terms of rams. They bring in I can't remember quite where all the rams come from, but there's a lot of movement between the flocks. So in terms of a fibre, one development that happened recently in Australia was giving Polwarth its own branding at market. So the Australian wool market is a very huge beast. It's the amount of money that kind of flows through those wool auctions is phenomenal and far-reaching. But
and also to the merino growers, they've spent millions establishing that brand. I mean, they, they certainly will be wanting to protect their patch, and quite rightly so. That investment has gone there. So, I mean, for most people that I come across, they don't even know it's a breed of sheep. So it's about how do you, establishing that name recognition to begin with, and then everything else will flow on after that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Polwarth is now a brand of wool that you can buy at auction. I don't think we've actually had any sales. I think we had one last year of some bales put up with PW on it rather than AAAM, which is the sort of merino standard. So I don't know what that'll do for the breed, but certainly what we've been trying to do, singularly as a little farm, is talk about Polwarth as a fibre. And recognising that there are different fibres for different purposes across the textile industry and within the craft industry as well. So we don't really plan to change it too much. Brother Al runs the flock these days, so my job is to sit in between the wool growing and the customers, and so he has that really well organised. We had a black and coloured sheep flock as well for the last 40 years. And so that's an interesting little...
And actually, you can't see this because you've got a cone there, but I'm standing here holding up a skein. So Tom's got his his rear facing camera towards him, so he can't see me. He can only hear me.
What are you doing? What are you doing?
Yeah, what are you doing, Marie? I'm actually holding up a skein of your fingering weight in that blended black and coloured. Yeah, in fact, the colour I'm holding up is, I think, exactly that colour that you've got in your hot little hand.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's utterly beautiful. And then I've got another, so that one's a fingering weight. This is a DK weight here. See, I did actually buy some things when I was over there, my friend.
Nice.
I know. Thank you. Now, I've got a couple more questions for Tom. So while I'm doing that, if anyone else has got some questions for Tom, pop them in the comments for me now, and I will make sure that I scroll through and pick those up. Sally Richardson said here, Tom, I never quite knew that you knew all of this. Go, Tom. I'm impressed. Winky face.
Good on you, Sal. Nice to see that there's nothing much going on in the Forest General Store today, but but it's that's really awesome. We're very lucky here, as I was mentioning before, with the community. There's a really great network of people around, and Sal's one of these people that run a little shop and just really keen to promote the area, to bring people to come and visit. So,
which is a perfect segue. Tell us about the homestay, because I know a lot of people probably aren't aware that that's also, I mean, as well as growing fantastic fibre and having a farm that your brother looks after, tell us about what goes on behind you.
Exactly, yeah. And so we've got accommodation in a couple of little cottages, which are completely shut at the minute. So it is an unusual time not having guests floating around at 10 o'clock every day. We'd normally have some guests to have a cup of coffee with and talk about everything. So people come and stay with us. They spend a bit of time on the farm. They might be coming because they've got a passion in wool, and there's a couple of other wool places to visit around the area, the National Wool Museum, and to an extent Great Ocean Road Woolen Mill. But certainly there's an ability to kind of indulge your fibre love. Yep. People also come because there's some amazing food around this area. It's a really good growing hub, and places like Bray Restaurant, just 5 minutes away, are constantly written up as like the top 5 restaurants to visit in Australia. So so there's certainly reasons to come and visit this little part of the world. And of course, the Great Ocean Road is
yeah, well, you'd be a staging post. I think a lot of people would be doing road trips, wouldn't they? And they would, you'd be sort of first stop ex-Melbourne or last stop before they hit town.
That's right, yeah. Rather than hitting the Great Ocean Road all in one hit, because that's it's a lot to take in all in one day. So we kind of recommend that you take a few days and obviously come and stay with us, because then you can kind of do day trips out, and it's nicer to do a hub and spoke kind of approach to travelling, I reckon. So that's what's here on the farm, as well as the wool shop. So we have that open 4 days a week, and that's a chance for people to come and see where the fibre comes from, go around and meet some of the sheep, go for a walk around and meet Daisy and Tansy when they kind of bustle up to you and pretend like they're being happy, but actually all they want is some oats out of your pocket.
Yeah, Daisy, I met Daisy, and she's quite, and she's quite a bolshy wee girl. She knows what she wants.
She does, yeah. No, they're really beautiful to have around, and that's what we can offer visitors, to come and see us when everything kind of gets back to that spot.
Well, Kurt Painstamp, Dom, he gave you a wave earlier on, and he wants to know what your favourite lamb recipe is.
Oh, good one, Kurt.
Because you're quite a wizard with it, and I have actually seen your culinary skills, and it's quite impressive.
Oh, yeah, good one. I think you really can't go past a slow roast shoulder, can you? Especially as it gets a little bit wintry around these parts.
And not even lamb too. I don't know about you, but I actually think slow roasted mutton shoulder.
Absolutely. You know what? I'm actually sitting at the front of the meat house right now. I'll tell you what it is, but it's but Brother Al over the weekend has put one into the meat house, and Polwarth is a beautiful meat. It's quite fine. I don't know how you describe meat. I'm not very technical with that.
No, it's got a fine grain. And merino is the same. It's not as like if you were to kill a classic New Zealand crossbreed, like a Romney crossbreed type sheep. It has a particularly once you start getting to the mutton stages, it's quite sort of a darker sort of a meat, and can be great for sort of slow cooked, and you get quite stringy. Whereas Polwarth and merino have a much finer grain to them, like they're right. Muscled, and they're really lovely and tender.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's yeah, that on a Sunday roast. Oh,
Mm.
good question, Kurt.
Yeah. Oh, very good. And actually, I'm going to the other one. I'm going to explain the dome behind you. I know it created great interest
Yeah, right.
when our team were there. Just explain what that dome is.
Well,
It's not
surprisingly, actually, Marie, it's not an ancient pizza oven, which is what most people ask, which is great. Let's not deny people their imagination, but it's actually a water tank. So
yeah.
when the house was set up here, it was sort of there was a couple of reasons why it needed to be here, and it's not on a water course. So they were very conscious of saving every bit of water they could use for the house. So that was a storage.
Very good, very good. Well, it's pretty much. Oh, actually, now if people are wanting to get some yarn, if they're wanting to get some Tarndie yarn, how do they do that?
That's great. We're only pretty small in terms of the amount of wool that we grow on the farm, and that's certainly uh, sort of driven how much we have available for people to buy. So for that reason, we don't wholesale anywhere. So you'll only really find us online or here at the shop. So maybe it makes it a bit more rare or something like that, but certainly by jumping onto our website at tarndie.com, then that's kind of where you can see what we've got on offer. And I'd love you to come and visit us. It's a nice new website that I'm still kind of ironing out a few kinks, but I'm kind of glad that we got that up and running before anything crazy happened.
It is looking better.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I jumped on this morning and I was like, Tom's been working on the website. It's looking a little bit more streamlined than last time I popped
Yeah.
by.
It was certainly this has sort of been a little business that sort of, I don't know, evolved and grown, and you set out making your own website and you think, yeah, that's fine. And then 8 years down the track, you realise
You and I did have that digital and social media chat when I was there, Tom. You are still very much a work in progress, my friend.
Yeah, please, yeah. We're pretty down to earth, kind of keeping it real kind of stuff out here.
Right. Okay. All right, you stick with that story, Tiger.
Yeah. That's my get out clause, right?
Yeah. Oh, well, look, fantastic. Thank you for all of that. Now, I've had about 3 questions asking. I'm wearing a cowl at the moment. 3 questions asking about my cowl. This is the Ever After cowl, which is actually one of my designs from Ravelry. It's free. If you happen to have actually a skein of Tarndie DK, that would be perfect in this cowl. It is sort of my go-to throw on. And this yarn actually is a 50-50 merino silk, and it's one... I talked about in an early diary, Tom, about when I go and visit places, I tend to purchase, instead of buying souvenirs from each place, I will actually buy yarn from each location as a souvenir. And sometimes it ends up in garments, and sometimes it ends up in what I call, I've moved a huge amount of my stash to the office. Well, you've seen it actually when you were last over. So I have this stash at the office, which I like to refer to as the library. Claire, my outsider, calls it my mess. It's a library, and I keep all of those skeins there because I do refer back to them. I do look at them. I take inspiration from them. And the yarn that I'm wearing is actually one that I bought in Chicago in 2012 from a producer up there, and it's a printed yarn, hand-dyed printed yarn, sort of back when those yarns were still very, very popular, and they're actually rotating around again. It's quite amazing how things
and what a great souvenir to have, Marie, as well.
Yeah, well, for me, memories get evoked by many, many things. So for some people, it will be hearing a song or some music. It will be the smell of something that's cooking or seeing a recipe, and for me, it is yarn and being able to create something from a yarn and being able to produce something, and that gives to me a good memory of where I'm at and what I'm going. What are you digging out there, my friend?
And so practical. I was just thinking, well, you've got some stuff on. I've got a couple of things here. I just wanted to quickly show. This one just came in the post last week.
Beautiful.
From Japan. So we've been selling raw fleece into Japan for the spinning market for about 30 years. And recently the lady from Spinhouse Ponta, Masumi Honda, she had spun this and knitted it and sent it back. So it's kind of interesting to see our wool that sort of starts out here.
Yeah.
The hands of people around the world can turn it into something really, really useful. So I really enjoyed getting that. But I also wanted to say this is kind of my workhorse jumper here, and it's our basalt that's been spun by the wonderful people at Skeins in New Zealand, and it's a Jared Flood design that I cannot quite recall at this point.
Kurt, great, Kurt. I know you're in comments. You'll probably recognise that interest instantly because I know Kurt's a huge Jared Flood fan. So if you know it, Kurt, throw it in the comments there for us. Well, I think it has been an utter delight to catch up with you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, how are Mum and sorry, we're going to catch up with her. How are Mum and Dad? Are they good?
They're hunkering down. I've got to say, Mum was super excited about this time for people to be made to reflect and slow down and these sorts of things. And so that's kind of what she's done. They've got themselves a nice garden in their town, in their house in Birregurra, and they're just hanging out there. She made a frog pond the other day, so she's pretty happy with that.
Yeah, well, that's good. So are you rattling around the house by yourself, and then you've got your brother next door?
Exactly. Yep. And they can come over and we're able to have coffee together. So that's pretty.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice. Yeah, our bubbles are a little bit more rigid.
Yeah.
But you know what? I think we're doing okay. You know, numbers here now for new cases are now have been steadily dropping for a number of days. So, with any luck, it will be just the 4 weeks. So we're all being very, very hopeful about that. And then it will be just sort of about where to, growing things and where to go from there. Which I think.
And on behalf of all of our kind of Aussie sheep breeders and knitters and friends, we send out all our love to you guys in New Zealand. You're very much our cousins and friends, and we hope you're all doing okay over there.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. And Kurt, bless you. He has popped it up. It's called Rift. Well done, Kurt. Excellent. All right, well, take care, Tom. And for everybody else there, I will be back tomorrow again, same time, same place. I will have a bit more progress for you. With any luck, fingers crossed, I'll actually have a finished object to show you. Stone the crows. That may actually happen. But until then, have a great day. Don't go anywhere, Tom, because I'll just want to talk to you before we finish off. But for everyone else out there, have a great day. I will see you again tomorrow. We've also got Sophia Moores-Kennedy coming up this week. We've got still pajama parties on Saturday with Ethan, and I'm working out with a few others as well. Thanks, Tom. Take care, everyone. See you tomorrow.